December 16, 1978. Vienna. Oscar Volkov wrapped his scarf tighter around his neck, tucking his chin deeper into the wool as he navigated the snow-dusted streets of Vienna's first district. The frigid air burned his lungs. Not as cold as Moscow, he mused, but with a dampness that reached into your bones. 20 years in America hadn't erased his sensitivity to European winters. He checked his watch, an ordinary Timex with an unremarkable leather band, nothing that would draw attention. 7:42 p.m. The opera would be letting out soon, and the cafe across the street would fill with patrons. Perfect cover for what needed to be done. Oscar found a table by the window, ordered coffee in passable German, and opened yesterday's International Herald Tribune. His eyes scanned the pages without reading, occasionally looking up as if searching for someone. To any observer, he was just another middle-aged businessman killing time before a meeting. The reality was far more complex. His handler at Langley had briefed him thoroughly before departure. This defector claims to have documentation of Project Amber Rose. If he's legitimate, it's the biggest intelligence coup since the war. Oscar remembered how the deputy director's voice had dropped to a near whisper. 30 years of Soviet penetration into our nuclear program, names we never suspected. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and Oscar glanced up. Not his contact, just a young couple shaking snow from their coats. He returned to his paper, thinking about the life he'd built in Maryland, the teaching position at Georgetown, his colonial home in Bethesda, the golden retriever that his neighbor walked each afternoon while he lectured on Soviet economic systems. His cover was nearly perfect because it wasn't entirely a cover. He genuinely loved teaching, loved the quiet academic life. At 8:17, the cafe door opened again. A thin man with a pronounced limp and salt and pepper hair surveyed the room, clutching a battered leather briefcase to his chest. His eyes met Oscar's for a fraction of a second, just enough. Oscar folded his newspaper, leaving it on the table with his half-finished coffee and a generous tip. He buttoned his coat and walked out, turning left toward Stephansplatz. 3 minutes later, he sensed rather than saw someone fall into step 15 yards behind him. Good. The Vienna station had sent backup. Oscar continued his leisurely pace, making a show of admiring the Christmas decorations that adorned the historic buildings. He turned onto a narrower street, then another, methodically working his way toward the rendezvous point, a small bookshop specializing in rare manuscripts. The shop was dimly lit, with floor-to-ceiling shelves and the comforting smell of old paper and leather bindings. The proprietor, a balding man with thick glasses, nodded at Oscar without speaking. They'd never met, but certain arrangements had been made. Oscar browsed the history section while watching the reflection in a glass cabinet. The bell chimed, and the limping man entered, stamping his feet and brushing snow from his shoulders. He approached the counter and inquired about a specific volume in halting English. The code phrase, "I believe we have that in our private collection," the proprietor replied, gesturing toward a door at the back of the shop. Oscar waited 30 seconds before following. The room beyond was small but comfortable, 2 armchairs, a small table, no windows. The limping man was already seated, briefcase on his lap. "Dr. Volkov," the man said in Russian-accented English. "I am Mikhail Sudayev, former colonel, Department 16, 1st Chief Directorate." Oscar remained standing. "Identification." Sudayev produced a small, dog-eared photograph and handed it to Oscar. It matched the one he'd been shown at Langley, Sudayev in uniform, 10 years younger, at what appeared to be a military ceremony. Oscar handed it back and finally sat down. "Why now?" Oscar asked, getting straight to the point. "You've had 25 years in Soviet intelligence. Why defect now?" Sudayev's hands trembled slightly as he placed the briefcase on the table between them. "Because I can no longer be part of it. Because what I discovered, He hesitated, searching for words. Some crimes are too great, even for men like us who have made our peace with deception. Oscar studied the man's face, looking for the telltale signs of a dangle, a false defector sent to pass disinformation. Sudayev's eyes held steady, but there was something in them that Oscar recognized. Fear, yes, but also the particular weariness that came from living too long with knowledge that weighed too heavily. Project Amber Rose, Oscar prompted. Not just Amber Rose. Sudayev unlocked the briefcase with a small key. Something much worse. The operation that made Amber Rose possible. He removed a thin file bound with twine and placed it on the table. This is only a small portion of the documentation. Insurance, you understand. The rest is secured elsewhere. Oscar didn't touch the file. Tell me what I'm looking at. The names of 28 agents recruited between 1946 and 1952. Scientists, military officers, government officials. High-level penetrations of your nuclear weapons program, your strategic planning offices, even your intelligence services. Sudayev leaned forward. But that is not what matters. What matters is who recruited them and how. For the next 40 minutes, Sudayev outlined an operation of such audacity that Oscar found himself shaken despite his decades in intelligence work. According to the Defector, the KGB had run a massive blackmail operation in the immediate post-war years, targeting American personnel with access to nuclear secrets. But the truly shocking revelation was who had made it possible. You're claiming that Assistant Secretary of War James Forrestal was compromised? Oscar kept his voice neutral despite his disbelief. Not compromised. Used. Sudayev tapped the file. Forrestal was never a Soviet agent. But someone very close to him was someone who had access to his private files, his appointments, his contacts with the scientists at Los Alamos. That person, codenamed Partisan, provided the information that allowed us to identify and target vulnerable individuals. Forrestal committed suicide in 1949, Oscar noted. Did he? Sudayev's expression was grim. Or did he begin to suspect what was happening? The file contains KGB surveillance photographs of Forrestal in the weeks before his death. He was meeting with FBI counterintelligence. He was getting close. Oscar's mind raced. If this was true, it would rewrite the early history of the Cold War. It would mean the Soviets had accelerated their nuclear program not just through scientific espionage but through a coordinated campaign facilitated by someone at the highest levels of the American defense establishment. Partisan's identity is in there? Oscar asked, nodding toward the file. No. That information is part of what I've secured elsewhere. Insurance, as I said. Sudayev smiled thinly. I need guarantees. New identity. Relocation, financial security. If this checks out, you'll get what you need. Oscar finally reached for the file. But I'm curious. Why come to me? Why not approach the Vienna station directly? Because your name is in that file, Dr. Volkov. Sudayev's voice had an edge now. Not as an agent, but as a victim. Your father was one of those blackmailed into cooperation. That's why he was sent to the gulag in 1952, wasn't it? Not for political dissidence as the official story goes, but because he tried to break free of control. Oscar's blood ran cold. His father's arrest and subsequent death in the camps was something he rarely discussed, the wound that had driven him to America and eventually into intelligence work. The official story was that Dmitry Volkov had been arrested for anti-Soviet statements. A common enough fate in Stalin's Soviet Union. Your file was flagged in our system, Sudayev continued. When I decided to defect, I knew you would have personal reasons to ensure this information comes to light. Self-interest is the most reliable motivation. Don't you agree? Before Oscar could respond, a sharp knock at the door made both men freeze. The bookshop owner entered, his previous calm replaced by barely contained panic. Two men just came in asking about you both by description, he said in rapid German. They're not browsing, they're searching. Oscar was on his feet instantly, years of training taking over. Is there another exit? Service door through the storage room leads to the alley. The proprietor was already backing out. I'll delay them. Oscar turned to Sudayev. We need to move. Now. The defector clutched his briefcase, his earlier confidence evaporating. They found me. How could they find me? Oscar didn't waste time on speculation. He ushered Sudayev through a narrow doorway lined with boxes of inventory into a cramped back room that smelled of mildew and old paper. A metal door at the rear opened onto a narrow alley dusted with fresh snow. Head north 3 blocks, then east to Stat Park, Oscar instructed, keeping his voice low. There's a footbridge over the Veen River. Cross it and wait by the statue of Johann Strauss. I'll be 15 minutes behind you. Sudayev hesitated, clutching Oscar's arm. If I'm not there, I'll find you, Oscar assured him, though both men knew it was far from certain. The sound of raised voices from the front of the shop spurred them into action. Sudayev slipped out into the alley, his limping gait painfully conspicuous in the fresh snow. Oscar closed the door quietly behind him, then moved swiftly back through the storage area, retrieving the file Sudayev had given him and tucking it inside his coat. He needed a diversion. The Vienna station had protocols for this, but there was no time to make contact. He'd have to improvise. Oscar returned to the main shop just as 2 men entered from the street. Both in their 30s, wearing dark overcoats, their movements too deliberate to be ordinary customers. KGB field officers, almost certainly. The proprietor was engaged in animated conversation with them, gesturing toward the history section where Oscar had been browsing earlier. Oscar stepped into view, adopting the slightly confused expression of a tourist. Entschuldigung, he said in deliberately accented German. Could you direct me to Hotel Sacker? I seem to have gotten turned around. The 2 men turned sharply. One took a half-step forward before his colleague placed a restraining hand on his arm. They weren't certain, a good sign. Oscar maintained his confused tourist facade as the proprietor, quick to understand, gave elaborate directions that would lead in exactly the opposite direction from where Sudayev had fled. Danke schön, Oscar said with a nod, then headed for the door, moving unhurriedly. He could feel their eyes on his back, assessing, calculating. The bell chimed as he stepped out into the snowy night. He turned right, following the fictional directions, walking at a moderate pace. In his peripheral vision, he saw one of the men exit the shop behind him, maintaining distance. Amateur work. If they were Vienna Residentia, they were clearly the B team. After 2 blocks, Oscar abruptly ducked into a crowded cafe, weaving through the tables to the restrooms at the back. As expected, there was a service exit that led to a different alley. He emerged into the cold again and immediately set off at a brisk pace, doubling back toward Stat Park by a circuitous route. The snow had intensified, fat flakes swirling in the glow of the street lamps. Good for obscuring tracks, bad for visibility. Oscar reached the park 17 minutes later, having taken extra precautions to ensure he wasn't followed. He brushed snow from his shoulders and hat before stepping onto the footbridge that spanned the Veen River. The park was nearly deserted, the weather keeping all but the most determined pedestrians indoors. The Johann Strauss statue stood illuminated at the center of a circular path, the golden figure seeming to conduct the falling snow. Oscar scanned the area methodically, noting a couple huddled on a distant bench and a solitary figure near the statue. Sudayev stood with his back to the monument, collar turned up against the cold, briefcase still clutched to his chest. His posture conveyed his anxiety, shoulders hunched, head swiveling at every sound. When he spotted Oscar, visible relief washed over his features. "We need to move quickly," Oscar said as he approached. My vehicle is parked near the Konzerthaus. From there, we go directly to the embassy. Sudayev nodded, falling into step beside him. Did they follow you? No, but we should assume they've called in reinforcements. Oscar kept his pace measured despite the urgency. Running would only draw attention. Once we reach the embassy, you'll be debriefed. If your information checks out, extraction will be arranged within 48 hours. They walked in tense silence, taking a path that cut diagonally across the park toward the eastern exit. The snow continued to fall heavily, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. Oscar maintained constant situational awareness, mentally marking every person they passed, every vehicle at the curb. As they neared the park exit, Sudayev suddenly stiffened. The woman with the red coat, he whispered. By the newspaper kiosk. I recognize her from Moscow Center. Oscar followed his gaze to a slender woman in a bright red wool coat, apparently examining magazines at a small kiosk. Are you certain? She was in Department 16, Technical Support Section. I don't know her operational name, but her presence here is not coincidence. Oscar made a split-second decision. Change of plan. We separate here. The embassy is too obvious now. He pulled a hotel key from his pocket, the emergency fallback location. Hotel Bristol, room 412. Go there and wait. Touch nothing, speak to no one. I'll be there within 2 hours. Sudayev took the key, his hand trembling slightly. And if you don't come? If I'm not there by midnight, use the phone in the room. Dial the embassy number and ask for cultural attaché. Use the phrase regarding the Klimt exhibition. They'll know what to do. With a terse nod, Sudayev turned and walked briskly toward a line of taxis at the curb. Oscar continued in the opposite direction, deliberately passing within 20 feet of the woman in the red coat. He made no eye contact but noted her features from his peripheral vision, mid-30s. Dark hair pulled back, high Slavic cheekbones. She showed no reaction to his presence, her attention seemingly fixed on the magazines before her. Too disciplined to be coincidence. Oscar was now certain they were being hunted. He spent the next 40 minutes executing textbook counter-surveillance measures, boarding and exiting a tram at the last moment, entering a department store through one entrance and leaving through another, doubling back unexpectedly. Finally satisfied he was clean, he made his way to a public phone booth near the Hofburg Palace. Cultural attaché, please, he said when the embassy operator answered. After a brief wait, a familiar voice came on the line. Cultural Office, Jenkins speaking. This is Professor Volkov. I need to discuss the acquisition of those manuscripts we talked about. The simple code would tell Jenkins this was an operational emergency. I see. Have you examined the items in question? Yes, they're authentic and extremely valuable. But there are complications with the seller. A pause. How significant are these complications? Significant enough to require special handling. I've relocated the seller to our secondary viewing location. I'll need a technical team to meet me there within the hour. Understood. Anything else we should prepare for? Oscar hesitated, then said, The provenance documents suggest these items were previously in the possession of Secretary Forrestal. The silence that followed spoke volumes. Finally, Jenkins said, I'll handle this personally. 1 hour. The line went dead. Oscar replaced the receiver and stepped back into the snowy night, already plotting his route to the Hotel Bristol. The mention of Forrestal would escalate this immediately to the highest levels. By morning, counterintelligence specialists would be en route from Langley. As he walked, Oscar's mind returned to his father, the brilliant physicist who had returned from a scientific conference in Copenhagen in 1949 a changed man. The sudden heavy drinking, the whispered late-night arguments with his mother, the increasingly erratic behavior that culminated in his arrest 3 years later. Had it all been the result of Soviet blackmail? Was his father's anti-Soviet activity actually an attempt to break free from his handlers? The snow was falling more heavily now, reducing visibility to a few yards. Oscar pulled his scarf higher across his face and quickened his pace. The Hotel Bristol was a 10-minute walk, and every instinct told him time was running short. He was 2 blocks from the hotel when the first shot cracked through the night. Oscar dropped instinctively, ducking behind a parked car as a second shot struck the vehicle's window, sending a shower of glass onto the snow beside him. Training took over. He assessed his position, exposed on a relatively empty street, armed only with the standard .38 special in his shoulder holster, with unknown number of hostiles. A third shot, this one striking the car's body with a dull thud. The shooter was good but not excellent, compensating for the weather conditions but not anticipating Oscar's movements. From his crouched position, Oscar spotted movement across the street, a figure in a dark coat moving swiftly between parked cars. He drew his weapon and waited, controlling his breathing despite the adrenaline surge. When the figure emerged into a pool of streetlight, Oscar was ready. He fired twice in rapid succession, not aiming to kill but to disable. The first shot missed. The second found its mark. The figure stumbled, clutching their leg, and dropped out of sight behind a snow-covered hedge. Oscar used the opportunity to move, sprinting across the street and down a narrow side alley. He needed to reach Sudayev before the KGB did. If they were willing to engage in open gunfire on a Vienna street, they were desperate, which meant Sudayev's information was even more significant than Oscar had initially believed. He reached the rear entrance of the Hotel Bristol 6 minutes later, using his embassy credentials to bypass the startled kitchen staff. Taking the service elevator to the 4th floor, he drew his weapon again as the doors opened, scanning the empty hallway before proceeding to room 412. The door was ajar. Oscar's heart sank. He pushed it open with his foot, gun at the ready. The room was in disarray. Furniture overturned, bedding strewn across the floor. Signs of a struggle but no blood. And no Sudayev. On the desk lay the defector's briefcase, conspicuously intact and apparently untouched. A trap? Oscar approached cautiously, examining it without touching. Nothing about it suggested an improvised explosive device, but he'd seen KGB technical services create deadly devices that looked perfectly harmless. The sound of approaching sirens made the decision for him. If this was a trap, so be it. The information was too valuable to abandon. He grabbed the briefcase and quickly searched the room for any other signs of Sudayev or his captors. Nothing. Oscar exited through the service stairs just as police vehicles pulled up to the hotel's main entrance. He made his way to the agreed extraction point, a small cafe 2 blocks from the American embassy, and settled in to wait, the briefcase secure beside his feet. Jenkins arrived 12 minutes later with 2 men Oscar recognized as embassy security officers. No words were exchanged. One officer took the briefcase while the other escorted Oscar to a diplomatic vehicle parked nearby. Within 5 minutes, they were inside the embassy compound, being ushered to a secure conference room in the basement. What happened? Jenkins demanded once the door was sealed. Oscar gave a concise report, concluding with Sudayev's disappearance from the hotel room. They left the briefcase deliberately. Either it's bait, or they already have what they wanted. Sudayev himself. Jenkins gestured to a technician who had been examining the briefcase. Anything? No explosives, no tracking devices. The technician reported. But it's empty. Just padding and lining. Empty. Oscar felt a cold certainty settle over him. They got to him at the hotel. They have the rest of his documentation, whatever he was using as insurance. If he even had it, Jenkins said grimly. This whole thing could have been an elaborate provocation. No. Oscar removed the file he'd taken from his coat and placed it on the conference table. He gave me this before we separated. It corroborates at least part of his story. Jenkins stared at the file for a long moment before reaching for it. You said he mentioned Forrestal. According to Sudayev, someone close to Forrestal, codenamed Partisan, provided the KGB with information that allowed them to target and blackmail American nuclear scientists and military officials in the late 1940s. My father was apparently one of their victims. Jenkins opened the file and began scanning the documents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. After several minutes, he looked up. This is going straight to Langley tonight. If it's authentic. He didn't complete the sentence. He didn't need to. If authentic, the file would reveal one of the most significant Soviet intelligence operations of the early Cold War, and potentially explain how the USSR had developed atomic weapons so quickly after World War II. What about Sudayev? Oscar asked. Jenkins shook his head. If the KGB has him, he's already on a plane to Moscow. Dead or alive. We need to at least try to find him. He knew the identity of Partisan. That information wasn't in the file. We'll make inquiries through Austrian authorities, but don't expect much. This whole situation stinks of a high-level operation. Jenkins closed the file. You'll be on the first diplomatic flight out tomorrow morning. Until then, you stay here under protection. Oscar wanted to argue but knew it would be futile. If Soviet intelligence had mounted an operation of this scale to recover Sudayev and his documentation, they wouldn't hesitate to target Oscar as well. He was escorted to a small but comfortable room within the embassy's secure area, where he spent a restless night reviewing everything Sudayev had told him, searching for clues he might have missed. The diplomatic flight to Washington the following morning was tense and quiet. Oscar shared the small government jet with 3 embassy staffers and a locked diplomatic pouch containing Sudayev's file and his own detailed report. Upon landing at Andrews Air Force Base, Oscar was immediately driven to Langley, where he was escorted to a conference room deep within the CIA headquarters. 4 men awaited him, the Deputy Director of Operations, the Head of Soviet Affairs, the FBI's counterintelligence liaison, and a silver-haired man Oscar recognized with shock as James Angleton, the legendary and recently retired head of CIA counterintelligence. For the next 6 hours, Oscar recounted every detail of his meeting with Sudayev and the subsequent events in Vienna. The men asked pointed questions, made notes, and occasionally exchanged glances that suggested they were fitting Oscar's information into a larger puzzle. We've authenticated the documents, the deputy director finally said. They match other intelligence in our possession regarding Soviet operations during that period. The question now is what to do with this information. Angleton, who had remained largely silent throughout the debriefing, leaned forward. The identity of Partisan is the key. If Sudayev was telling the truth, someone close to Forrestal betrayed the most sensitive American secrets at the dawn of the atomic age. That person may still be alive, possibly still active in government circles. But without Sudayev, we have no way to identify Partisan, the FBI liaison pointed out. Perhaps we do, Oscar said quietly. All eyes turned to him. Sudayev said my father was one of those blackmailed. If that's true, there might be records in my father's personal effects. Letters, journals, something that could help narrow down who had access to Forrestal during that critical period. The deputy director exchanged glances with Angleton. Your father's papers are still in the Soviet Union? Most of them. After his arrest, my mother managed to hide some of his personal correspondence before the KGB searched our apartment. When we emigrated in 1958, she brought them with her. They've been in storage ever since. Where? Angleton asked sharply. A safety deposit box in Bethesda. I've never examined them closely. My mother refused to discuss my father's arrest, and after she died, Oscar hesitated. I couldn't bring myself to confront that part of our past. The deputy director nodded to an aide, who immediately left the room. "We'll arrange for those materials to be retrieved immediately. In the meantime, we need to proceed with extreme caution." If Partisan was as highly placed as Sudayev suggested, the political implications could be explosive. "This goes beyond politics," Angleton said coldly. "This is about the most fundamental breach of American security in the post-war period. If Forrestal was murdered to protect Partisan's identity, he left the thought unfinished." The debriefing concluded with Oscar being informed that he would be placed under protective surveillance until further notice. His academic obligations at Georgetown would be handled through appropriate channels. For his own safety, he was not to return to his home or contact anyone outside approved channels. 3 days later, Oscar found himself in a CIA safe house in rural Virginia, examining his father's papers alongside 2 agency analysts and a historian specializing in the early Cold War period. The materials had yielded tantalizing but incomplete clues: references to meetings with American officials in Copenhagen, cryptic notations about pressure and impossible choices, and a name that appeared repeatedly: Julia Drayson. "Who is Julia Drayson?" Oscar asked, looking up from a letter dated March 1949. The historian adjusted her glasses. "Forrestal's personal secretary from 1946 until his death in 1949. She had complete access to his schedule, his correspondence, his meetings with the atomic scientists and military planners." One of the analysts slid a photograph across the table, a group picture showing Forrestal with his staff. A young woman stood slightly behind him, her expression serious, professional. "That's Drayson," the analyst said. "After Forrestal's death, she worked briefly for the Atomic Energy Commission, then disappeared from government service. Married a businessman named Howard Carter in 1950 and effectively vanished into private life." Oscar stared at the photograph. "Is she still alive?" "Very much so. Julia Carter, née Drayson, lives in Alexandria. 82 years old, widowed, active in local historical society work." The analyst's tone was neutral, but the implication was clear. If Drayson was partisan, she had lived for decades as a respected community member, her treachery never suspected. "We need to be absolutely certain before proceeding," the second analyst cautioned. "The evidence is circumstantial at best." "There's one way to be certain," Oscar said, tapping another letter. This one mentioning a distinctive brooch that the American woman always wore, a gift from her employer that contained a hidden compartment. According to the letter, Dmitry Volkov had seen her use it to conceal microfilm during their meeting in Copenhagen. If Julia Drayson was partisan, and if she kept mementos of her service, the historian nodded slowly. A search of her residence might yield conclusive evidence. But it would require a warrant, which means involving the Justice Department and risking leaks. "Not necessarily," one of the analysts said. "Given the national security implications, this could be handled as a black bag job. Completely deniable." Oscar felt a growing unease. "If we're wrong about her, we'd be violating the civil rights of an innocent elderly woman. And if we're right," the analyst countered, "we'd be exposing a Soviet agent responsible for one of the most damaging espionage operations in American history, possibly including the murder of a cabinet secretary." The decision wasn't theirs to make. That evening, the deputy director arrived at the safe house with authorization for a covert entry operation targeting Julia Drayson's residence. Oscar was stunned to learn he was expected to participate. "You're not field-trained for this type of operation," he protested. "Precisely why you're perfect," the deputy director replied. "You're a professor with a legitimate research interest in Cold War history. Your cover for meeting her is solid. While you engage her in conversation away from the house, our technical team will conduct the search." Oscar wanted to refuse but found himself thinking of his father, the brilliant physicist broken by Soviet blackmail, who died in the gulag never knowing his son would someday have a chance to uncover the truth behind his downfall. 2 days later, Oscar sat across from Julia Drayson Carter in a quiet corner of the Alexandria Historical Society, where she volunteered 3 afternoons a week. She was remarkably well-preserved for her age. Silver hair styled elegantly, posture still erect, her eyes sharp behind fashionable glasses. It's not often we get professors interested in the minutiae of post-war Washington, she said, smiling warmly. Most historians focus on the grand events, not the day-to-day functioning of government offices. The grand events emerge from those daily operations, Oscar replied, activating the recording device disguised as a fountain pen in his jacket pocket. I'm particularly interested in James Forrestal's tenure as the first Secretary of Defense. You were his personal secretary, I believe. A shadow crossed her face briefly. Yes, from his time as Secretary of the Navy through his tragic end as Defense Secretary. Brilliant man. Terribly misunderstood. Misunderstood in what way? She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. History has been unkind to him. The official record suggests he suffered a mental breakdown, became paranoid about communist infiltration. But those of us who worked closely with him knew he had legitimate concerns. She leaned forward slightly. Forrestal understood before many others that the Soviet threat was real and immediate. Oscar felt a chill. Was this an admission of sorts? Or a clever deflection? What do you think drove him to suicide? Julia's eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. Who says it was suicide? Professor Volkov? Before Oscar could respond, his phone rang, the prearranged signal that the technical team had completed their search of her residence. He apologized for the interruption, claiming it was his department chair, and arranged to continue their conversation another day. As he drove back to the safe house, Oscar's mind raced. Julia's question about Forrestal's death suggested she knew, or at least suspected, that his suicide had been something else entirely. But was that the insight of a co-conspirator or simply the skepticism of someone who had known the man well? The technical team's report, delivered an hour after Oscar's return, provided the answer. We found it, the team leader said, placing a small velvet jewelry box on the table. Inside was an exquisite Art Deco brooch, silver and sapphire, crafted to resemble a stylized bird in flight. Hidden compartment in the base, just as described in your father's letter. Empty now, but our lab found trace evidence of photographic film. And there was this. He produced a small, leather-bound diary, hidden behind a false panel in her bedroom. It's coded, but our cryptographers are optimistic. The structure suggests a fairly simple substitution cipher, probably changed periodically using a key phrase. Oscar opened the diary carefully. Pages of neat, precise handwriting filled with seemingly random letters and numbers. If this contained Julia Drayson's operational record as a Soviet agent, it would be the final proof needed to confirm Sudayev's allegations. It took the CIA's cryptographers 3 days to break the cipher, using cultural and historical references gleaned from Julia's known biography as possible key phrases. The breakthrough came when they tried For Russian Art, the title of an exhibition Julia had helped organize at the National Gallery in 1948, which had featured Soviet painters. The decrypted contents were devastating. Julia Drayson had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1943 while working as a clerk in the War Department. Her initial handler had recognized her potential when she mentioned being assigned to Forrestal's staff. Over the next 6 years, she had provided information that allowed the KGB to identify and subsequently blackmail or recruit at least 22 individuals with access to America's nuclear weapons program. Most shockingly, the diary contained an entry from May 1949 describing her role in Forrestal's death. According to her account, Forrestal had begun to notice discrepancies in his schedule and documents. He had scheduled a private meeting with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Before that meeting could take place, Julia had provided access to Forrestal's hospital room to 2 Soviet operatives, who had staged his fatal fall from the window as a suicide. "My God!" Oscar whispered as he finished reading the translation. "She's been living quietly in Alexandria all these years, knowing what she did." The deputy director nodded grimly. "The diary confirms every major claim Sudayev made, plus details we had no idea about. The damage she caused, it's almost incalculable." "What happens now?" Oscar asked. "Justice Department is preparing an arrest warrant. FBI will take her into custody tomorrow morning." The deputy director studied Oscar's face. "You've helped uncover one of the most significant espionage cases in American history. Your father would be proud." Oscar wasn't sure about that. His father had been a victim in this story. A brilliant mind compromised through blackmail, his life and career destroyed. There was no triumph in that knowledge, only a profound sadness for what might have been. The arrest of Julia Drayson Carter the following day made headlines around the world. Initial reports described her simply as a former government employee charged with espionage, but as details emerged over subsequent weeks, the full magnitude of the case became clear. Julia, facing multiple counts of espionage and accessory to murder, chose to cooperate in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Her detailed confession confirmed everything in her diary and more. The ripple effects were enormous. Historical narratives about the early Cold War had to be rewritten, the circumstances of Forrestal's death officially re-examined, and the careers of numerous scientists and officials posthumously reconsidered. For Oscar, the case brought a bittersweet form of closure. His father's name was cleared, his memory rehabilitated. The Soviet government, responding to international pressure during the new era of glasnost, released previously classified files confirming that Dmitry Volkov had been arrested not for dissident activities, but for attempting to break free from KGB control, exactly as Sudayev had suggested. As for Mikhail Sudayev, his fate remained unknown for nearly a decade. It was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that Oscar learned the truth. The defector had indeed been captured in Vienna that snowy night, returned to Moscow, and executed after a brief show trial. His act of conscience, though it had cost him his life, had exposed a conspiracy that had remained hidden for almost 40 years. On a cold December morning in 1989, as the Berlin Wall was being dismantled piece by piece, Oscar stood at his father's newly marked grave in a Moscow cemetery. The Soviet authorities, in one of the many gestures of historical reconciliation that characterized that tumultuous period, had allowed Dmitry Volkov's remains to be reburied with full honors, his headstone now bearing the truth: scientist, patriot, victim of tyranny. Oscar placed a small stone on the headstone, following the Jewish custom his father had always observed despite the dangers of religious expression in the Soviet era. "It's done, Papa," he said quietly. "The truth is known now. You can rest." As he turned to leave, he noticed an elderly man watching him from a respectful distance. Something about the man's posture, military-bearing despite his advanced age, caught Oscar's attention. He approached cautiously. "Professor Volkov," the man said in accented English, extending his hand. "I knew your father briefly. I was part of the security detail at the Copenhagen conference in 1949. Oscar shook the offered hand, noting the man's firm grip despite his age. "You're a long way from home, Mr. Ivanov." "Sergei Ivanov." The man smiled faintly. "Like many of my generation, I'm trying to make peace with the past before it's too late. Your father was a good man caught in terrible circumstances. He refused to provide the information they wanted, even under extreme pressure. His courage was remarkable." They walked together through the cemetery, Ivanov sharing memories of that pivotal conference where Dmitry Volkov had first been approached by Soviet intelligence. As they neared the exit, the old man paused. "There is something else you should know, Professor." Sudayev was not the first to try to expose this conspiracy. There were others over the years, people of conscience who recognized the injustice. All were silenced. Ivanov's eyes, remarkably clear for his age, held Oscar's gaze. History is rarely as simple as we would like it to be. Remember that when you tell your father's story. As he left the cemetery, Oscar thought of Julia Drayson, now serving her life sentence in a federal prison. Of Mikhail Sudayev, whose decision to defect had cost him his life but revealed a long-hidden truth. Of his father, whose refusal to cooperate had led to his destruction but whose memory was finally restored. The Cold War had been fought not just with missiles and armies but with secrets and silences. The battle to understand it truly, to separate fact from fiction, heroism from propaganda, would continue long after the physical conflicts had ended. It was a battle fought in archives and memories, in declassified documents and personal recollections, in the space between official histories and lived experiences. For Oscar Volkov, that battle had become his life's work. In his courses at Georgetown, in his meticulous research, in his quiet efforts to honor those who had stood firm against pressure and fear, he kept faith with the past while looking toward a future where such secrets might no longer be necessary. The snow began to fall as he reached his hotel, soft flakes drifting down from a pearl-gray sky, not unlike that Vienna evening 11 years earlier when a limping defector had stepped from the shadows to change history with the truth he carried.